Here. We're live over here. We are. Hello, welcome to Derps Talk About Games. I'm your co-host, Mango.
And I am your co-host, Buddy.
And today we're going to talk a little bit about designing your own campaign setting. Before we do that, Buddy, I want to tell the folks at home what it is we do on this podcast.
On this podcast, we like to talk about games. So, I guess we should. I guess I will. I can do the introduction. Basically, here's the story. Here's what happened. I was in a Discord server with people who I like very much, and they were basically talking about the DM problem, which is that apparently everybody wants to play in tabletop RPG games. Nobody ever wants to run them, which I found very strange. I love running tabletop RPG games, right? So I was like, "Oh, is that a real issue? I'll theoretically run something for you guys." And on the spot, I kind of came up with sort of I didn't quite come up with these, but I sort of pitched 3 kind of micro campaigns, right? The idea is it's a 6 session sort of story. It's a little mini campaign. I'd be happy to run it kind of thing. I pitched 7th Expedition, which you did a campaign pitch me on. I pitched Kovalgrad, which is the version of Stalingrad that is a campaign pitch me we did. And then I pitched a third one that's just 7 samurai, but against bandits instead, but against paladins instead of bandits, right? You would maybe like that one, because it's the idea. The idea is that at a toll station in the mountains, a group of paladins are oppressively stealing kind of taxes from people who don't from people who don't want to pay them. So it's maybe the most libertarian campaign idea I've ever come up with. But so I pitched these 3, and people got really into it. And I basically said, okay, well, listen, I'm gonna need some time to sort of like set this up. Let me get to work on
Lou
this.
says taxation is theft in the chat.
Yeah. So let me get to work on it. So what I did was I went back to an old campaign setting of mine called Ceran, and I began editing, because that was a campaign setting I used for 4th edition. And I began editing that campaign setting. In order to sort of update it for 5th edition, and also just change some stuff, right? The old version of Ceran was, I was kind of fascinated like 10 years ago with this idea of like fantasy racism. A lot of my campaign settings were very built on this idea that there were sort of imperial, oppressive races and sort of dark races, right? But like that there's nothing but that there's some level in institutionalized like discrimination or whatever. But I mostly lifted all of that out. It's not the kind of thing that I kind of wanted to focus on. But as I was revamping this, and then a second thing happened. The second thing is, I have a weekly game with a group of people, some of whom are in the chat. Hey, what's up? Which has been canceled a couple of times, and I basically offered, I was like, hey, if we're gonna cancel, because both of those games are run by Rachel, and I was like, if we're gonna cancel, I can actually prepare a game so that if you need a night off, we can just play my game, essentially, right? And I sort of pitched this last week, and now we're kind of like going through it. So I've been so now it's kind of going in 2 different directions, right? We're revamping this campaign setting for this group of, one group of people, and also for friends in my regular sort of D&D group. And the process of doing this has actually been pretty fun and interesting, because it's a question of like what makes a good campaign setting, right? Is what I keep asking myself over and over again. Like, what are some of the things that make a good campaign setting? What do I care about? What am I thinking about? How am I orienting, whatever, some of the different sort of like elements. And I guess, I don't know, really I just want to talk about some of the like the thought process that went into all of that. I don't know. Does that make sense? Is that a good frame?
It does. I'm curious to see what your thoughts are, like what, like, the way you're framing this is like what makes a good campaign setting. And I don't know if I like have a thing in my head where it's like, oh well, it's got to have this or got to have that. I think like most of it's pretty flexible and floating. I think there are things that make things better and more memorable, but I don't know how much, like, how granular you can get there. So I'm interested to see what you think.
Yeah, so part of this is definitely that I was thinking about I'm trying not to think in terms of details. I'm trying to think of in terms of like, strains of thought in a way,
Okay.
right? So for instance, something I was thinking about, I've had this this idea in my head for a long time. Have I ever explained hooks and anchors to you in like in other terms?
It sounds familiar. Why don't you re-explain it for the folks
Okay,
at home?
so a hook and an anchor. This is something I use in my professional life. A hook and an anchor are two opposite um kind of ideas in sort of like the way that we approach new stuff, right? The hook, to frame this in video game terms, right? So if I'm thinking about an indie game, right? I'm thinking about signing an indie game. I'm thinking about playing an indie game or something like that. That game has to have a hook, right? What is the new, interesting, innovative thing that this game is doing that nobody else is doing? Right. And that attracts me to it. So a good example for Australia would be like the dice, right? Being able to describe an indie game as it's like blank, but with blank is kind of describing your hook, right? It's like, or your hook and your anchor, actually, in a lot
It's
of ways.
like Uber for pets, right? Like, it's like
Yeah,
the
exactly.
classic startup
When I say
version.
it's like Slay the Spire, but with dice. Dice is the hook, right?
Yeah.
Dice is the promise of something new and interesting to kind of like go into. The anchor is the opposite, and it's the first part of that sentence, right? It's like Slay the Spire, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of the time this is just genre, right? This is the part that explains in very simple terms what is the core thing. You know, if the hook is the new thing that grabs your attention, the anchor is the thing that reassures you, right? That, oh, this is a thing I like. I'm already kind of like on board and engaged with this. And I was thinking a lot about sort of like hooks and anchors when I was like rewriting all of this stuff, because one of the things that I've done for this campaign setting, I guess to talk about, let's talk about hooks first. One of the things I did for this campaign setting was I very explicitly tried to draw out what I think the hook is, in a couple of different ways. But the core one is that it's built around sort of, it's almost like Victorian in sort of timescale in my head, right? It's a little less medieval fantasy, like industrial fantasy, if that makes sense.
Diesel punk,
Because
like WoW range-ish almost.
sort of the idea in lore is that there's sort of power, there are these arcane power crystals, right, that have been discovered. You know, arcane power crystals exist. They were sort of like inert, nobody really understood what it did for a long time, and then somebody cracked it and realized, oh, actually I understand arcane magic, I understand ley lines, I understand these power crystals, and I can charge a power crystal and have it power a thing, right?
Sure.
So it is sort of the fantasy equivalent of like the understanding of coal and oil, like fossil fuels, as ways to power factories, right? In a similar sort of setting. But the idea is that it comes out of these power crystals or whatever. Because I feel like you know, when I think of like a stereotypical D&D setting, we're thinking very medieval fantasy,
Sure.
and that's very true, right? Or even you would maybe bump it up to like Renaissance, right?
I mean, it's kind of a pastiche, right? Like, you getting into the
Yeah.
historicity of D&D, it like spans anywhere from like, 900 to like 1800s, right? Like, like you even get like some of the tip of that Victorian era stuff. But anyway,
Yeah. And then and so the idea is that there's this arcane revolution going on, and part of that is that like arcane magic and wizards are like very new, right? This is something that has only kind of cropped up in the last 100 years. I feel like I like the idea that sort of in the same way that sort of like the Enlightenment changed the, you know, whatever, like kind of like the academic thought processes of history, like medieval history, which is very based on sort of like religion, into something more secular. That's something that I'm kind of mirroring, but with kind of power, like power sources, right? Magic used to just be divine magic, right? You got magic from the gods gave you your magic, and the only kind of magic was divine magic, right? But now we have this under, you know, like here's a scholar, he says, hey, here are ley lines, you can draw on this to make, you know, arcane magic work or whatever. And so now people can learn to be wizards, and they can learn to, you know, cast spells on their own and that kind of thing, which I think is kind of like neat
very
and
interesting. So like,
Yeah.
like there's like a couple of old wizards, but only because like, it's like, what the practice of magic is like how old at this point?
Yeah, because the practice of magic would be very old, because there's also other pieces of this too. I can't, because, you know, it's like a rabbit hole or whatever, right?
Sure.
But the very first types of magic are primal magic, right? Druidism, right? Essentially, like druids, rangers, barbarians, that kind of magic, and then that gets superseded by divine magic, just because, you know, I don't know.
Right, right.
I don't want to get bogged down in explaining that stuff, obviously, right? But for however many, I don't even remember if it's the scale is definitely thousands of years, but forever, however many thousands of years, right? Almost all of the magic in in the Empire would be coming from divine sources.
Right, right. But the study of arcane magic is relatively new.
Oh yeah, the idea is that's 100 years is
Okay.
that time frame, right? That
Okay.
we are, kind of I guess if I were to like put a relatively recent sort of year, it would be like maybe like the late 1800s or something, right?
Okay.
Um in terms of whatever this like process of sort of fantasy industrialization.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, that is a neat premise. You like sorcerers exist?
Yeah, sorcerers do exist, and so do warlocks. Both casting arcane magic and spells. And the idea with sorcerers is that they just appeared randomly and nobody really knew why, and they can cast this shit, but like only that you're like there's no study to that because it's so sort of innate and
Right.
intuitive. That they are kind of like anomalies, right? And then warlocks are interesting because one of these things, this is a thing that I like about D&D settings. I don't like other planes, right?
Sure.
So I don't like the idea that you could go to hell, you could go to whatever, like you could hop in a portal and plane shift to whatever, the Feywild or something like that, right? But the idea is that there are other like divine magic comes explicitly from the gods, but there are other beings who are outside of the material plane who you can contact, right? And they can grant you access to arcane magic, right? So essentially this would be making a deal with a demon, and the demon teaches you how to cast arcane magic, right? But those are both very intuitive processes rather than very inductive, deductive processes. I don't know,
Yes,
whatever.
studied, right? Like
Exactly, right.
academic.
Yeah, no sorcerer could sit down and teach a non-sorcerer how to cast spells, is the idea.
Right.
But the idea of a wizard is that you can sit down and teach somebody spells. Um, so yeah, and then the other thing is that tieflings and ASMR have a different origin for this same sort of reason. Tieflings are essentially any child that has been sort of suffused with arcane magic. Is essentially born as a tiefling, and an Aasimar is any child that's been suffused with divine magic,
Interesting.
as opposed to uh being like the offspring of like demons and devils or
Sure,
whatever.
sure.
Because I like the idea of those things like showing up, but it should be like hard to summon a demon, right? Like the an occult ritual is needed to summon a demon versus being able to cast a simple spell in your daily spell slots.
Sure, sure. No, that makes sense. Um, and so just because I'm curious now, did the sorcerers start showing up like 100 years ago, or have they always been around?
They've always been around. So the ley
Okay.
lines have always been around, but people didn't understand them.
Okay.
And part of it is that it's like the application of the scientific method. So for instance, the power crystals exist. The power crystals are in the desert. There's this desert in the bottom. And when it's frankly, it's a little Dune inspired. I'm gonna be real with you. Okay. The power crystals are spice mango. Okay. The idea is that there are these constant sandstorms ripping through the desert. And as the sandstorms pull up sand, right? You can actually get the levels of sand low enough that people can go in and they can dig and they can just find all of these power crystals. And the idea was the crystals themselves were just kind of like a neat ornament, right? Like a noble would like put one in their house, right? And weird things happened, right? How come when this noble puts the power crystal in his house, it glows faintly, or it's warm to the touch, or something like that, right? Versus if he takes it somewhere else, right? And the tracking down of the answers to those questions, would eventually sort of led to the revelations that it's sitting on a ley line, right? And it's drawing the ambient arcane energy from that ley. One of the other things is that sorcerers will be born at like junctions on a ley line. There's like a detail that I love, sort of the idea of, even it's kind of stupid if you think about it, which is that like a house sitting on sort of like a nexus of ley lines kids born in that house would just happen to be sorcerers a lot, right? Because they're sort of sitting on this thing, but nobody would really understand why that's. It's just like a weird circumstance, right? Until someone actually kind of performs the scientific method.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Lou in the chat says this is like half of my JRPG life. That sounds. It sounds pretty JRPG. Like a lot of Final Fantasy kind of operates like that, right? Like, you know, weird mix of like very medieval, but also like, you know, weird industrialization happening at some corner of things, right?
Yeah,
like,
I guess that's true. It's part of this is that I really like the idea of airships. I've always been a big
oh,
fan
okay.
of,
So
yeah. That is the. But we didn't even talk about that. Is the thing. I saw like we haven't even gotten there. Right?
No, it's just very funny that like you're like, I don't know, but I also like airships. It's just like, yeah, okay, put the cherry on top of it. Why don't you?
That I hadn't revealed the most JRPG parts of this setting. You know, this like story or whatever. Yeah. Anyway, so some of this stuff is what I think of as like the hooks, right? But then the anchors are things like, you know, the elves live in the woods, the dwarves live in mountains, you know, the humans are everywhere and they're genial and they're nice and they're kind of like the dominant species, all this kind of stuff, right? Like this is what I think of as like anchors, because part of what I think happens when people are approaching a campaign setting is they
everything to be distant.
They want it's almost the difference between silk and sandpaper, right? You want silk because it's comfortable, right? It's soft, right? But you want sandpaper because it gives you traction. It gives you something it gives you texture. It gives you something to kind of like latch on to in a way. And so some of the stuff I'm sort of like designing is this stuff, right? The lore that needs to be explained so that someone could understand, okay, if you want to play a wizard in this universe, here's the rule. Right? But some of this stuff should be silk. It should just be, yes. Oh, you want to play an elf? Cool. The elves live in the forest. They like druids and rangers and nature, and that's what they're like. You know what I mean? It's like, that's very intuitive. People just immediately understand that, right? Which I think is, I don't know, like that's like part of the give and take. Also, I just wholesale rip off certain, this is the other thing about this campaign setting. There are just Skaven here, just because I like Skaven, and I'm just ripping them off from Warhammer.
Sure. Yeah.
Stuff like that.
And then you're not publishing it, so you can even call them Skaven if you want, right? Like, no.
Yeah, the Skaven are in the mountains, and when I was drawing, I had this map. You know, honestly, I could probably pull it up. I have this like map, and I wanted to write the Skaven Under Empire, because it's like the right you'd call the Under Empire. Skaven have been fighting against Dragonborn. They're taking over these Dragonborn. Dragonborn have mountains, volcanic citadels. Skaven have been fighting the Dragonborn for a long time, driving them out of these volcanic citadels, taking over that space is their own. So they're in these like southern mountains. But then I decided that it would actually be more accurate to just write rats on like their section of the map. The woodworker and me listening to Buddy describe why you like sandpaper. I'm describing the difference. It's a metaphor, okay? it's a metaphor.
Yeah, interesting. No, it just is something that occurs to me. It's like it is funny to me that like we don't have an Underdark in the real world, right? Like, but because D&D did it, like everybody else is like, oh, there's a secret underground world where all the underground guys live, and you know, it's like a whole other world. And it's, you know, not a thing that like really happens that often. I don't know. I just think that's super funny. I mean,
we know more about space than we do about, or what? There's like some Carl Sagan quote about this, right? We know more about distant stars than we do about the like our own our own core of the earth or something like that.
Yeah, I think it's usually like the depths of the ocean, like that too.
Oh, that's also true. Yeah,
but like, you know, we do know that there aren't like a ton of holes. You know, it's not like a giant cave system. I mean, unless you believe in like Hollow Earth or whatever. But you know, I don't think either of us do.
Yeah, I mean, there's that one hole that the Soviet, you know about this? The Soviet Union just drilled a hole to see as deep as they possibly could for the sole scientific purpose of, let's see how, if we just keep drilling down, let's see how deep it goes, kind of thing. It's like a famous fucking hole, but eventually it got so hot that it kept melting their drill bits, I'm pretty sure, and they had to stop.
Lula Chat says, I believe the Earth is both hollow and flat. Well, so let me tell you, Lou, about former flat Earth theory, which is essentially this. It's that the world was flat and then it got hit by like a comet and it wrapped around itself. And so now it's a hollow Earth. The former flat Earth theory, Lou, look it up.
Have you ever, I wonder what playing a true flat Earth like. Could you make a D&D campaign out of a flat Earth?
Yeah,
Maybe.
it's called the Discworld series by Terry Pratchett.
Oh, I didn't even think about that. That's a great example. That's a great
Yeah,
example.
right. Like, I mean, and, you know, if you read like the first book, he lays out a lot of stuff. It's like, Turnwise and Widdershins, right? Like, and everything's kind of like oriented around the hub is like temperate, and the rim is alternatingly like no, the hub is cold and the rim is tropical, I believe. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, the Underdark is actually a pretty good example of something that's pretty of something that's pretty interesting, because like I was thinking about this in WoW terms as well, right? Like, if I think of like the Warcraft universe as a campaign setting, the Warcraft universe takes a lot of sort of its cues from D&D, right?
right.
And we sort of have that now, right? You can have Zarelek Cavern, which is, kind of like the Underdark. The whole next, expansion is built on sort of going into whatever, sort of like the Underdark. Which is traditionally not a part of D&D lore that I love all that much. Just because like I don't even know if I would call it like practical, but there's something about like wouldn't it just fill with water? How does the Underdark not just fill with water? Has that ever been answered?
I don't think all things below sea level automatically fill with water. I mean, there's only so much water. Like, there are like aquifers, but not everything's necessarily
Yeah, I
an
guess.
aquifer. Also, like,
It just feels like if the world is actually hollow and there is the Underdark and oceans are also huge and vast, you would just think about the weight of the ocean, right? Are we saying that that's being cradled by like a lattice of like granite or something like that? It would be wild.
I
It'd be
mean,
so heavy.
it would,
Do you know what I mean?
but like the pressure wouldn't be directly down. Like, assuming, I don't know, I don't know how canonically deep the Underdark is, but assuming it, like, that, like, maybe a dwarf once, like, made a wrong turn and ended up drowning his, like, his city. But like, if there's like a large enough distance, if it's like, one is probably not as deep as the oceans, but as long as it doesn't get close enough to because the oceans are also oceans to the Underdark. They're just like oceans that are with like a wall of stone in between them, right? Like,
Okay, I guess that's true. Yeah, maybe the Underdark is as deep as the oceans. The Underdark is at its deepest around 10 miles underground. Okay. Wow, interesting. But yeah, maybe the Underdark is just under the continents themselves, right? So
yeah,
there's no ocean to spill into, I guess.
yeah.
That's maybe fair enough. I would maybe accept that as a, as an explanation. Um yeah, that's something that I've been thinking about when it comes to sort of like this campaign setting is like, what are some of the things about D&D that are realistic, like unrealistic, that bother me that I want to fix, right? And the Underdark is kind of secretly one of those. I like the idea of not Underdark, but like underground cities in terms of like the mountains. Like I love the idea of like Moria, right? The mines of
Sure.
Moria is a fantastic like Erebor or whatever, right? We're dwarves, we hollow out the inside of this mountain and we in this campaign setting, it's dwarves and dragonborn who do that. Uh, but I don't know how much I like the idea of a true sort of like network of Underdark. Um, Even though I also do like that idea in
Rich
other
in the
ways.
chat
So
says, I mean, I think the idea of it is just a dude went into a cave and was like, bro, this is crazy.
yeah, that's really all it takes. Yeah.
Yeah, that is maybe the Doyleist explanation, but still room for the Watsonian one as well.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Watsonian is like the in-universe, the
Yeah,
diegetic explanation. Doyleist is like the author level explanation. That
yeah,
makes
yeah.
sense. Yeah. Um. Yeah. Yeah. I think I like the idea of like honestly the thing I like about dwarves and dragonborn and Skaven or whatever as sort of like an underground dwelling race is less that they live underground and is more that they kind of craft communities underground. Like I have this section when it talks about like dwarves, how the dwarves live in this plateau. It's very Russian. These are like very Russian dwarves. They live on this plateau, and there's not a lot of and they're like shepherds, right? Not a lot of arable farmland or whatever in these steppes, and so they need every ounce of real estate in order to like whatever, let their yaks feed and shit like that. And so they built their homes underground as a a space saving mechanism, right? You just can't dedicate square footage that would otherwise go to feeding fucking yaks to this, so they built underground homes or whatever in cities or whatever. Um, yeah, your drow live in swamps. How dare you take away our giant caverns and give them to... That's true. The drow do live in swamps, but I love the idea of a swamp. This comes from a very specific thing of, I love the idea of drow as a slave society, and I love the idea as a slave society mirrored on the antebellum South with New Orleans as its sort of center, like as its cultural center. But
So,
I don't, you know.
so the drow are slavers then, and what do they enslave? Other drow?
They enslave everybody.
Okay.
They're also pirates. Part of the drow is that they are pirates, and they get on ships and they go on big pirate, slaving expeditions where they go just like round up a bunch of slaves. And they have easy slaves. They can get Skaven, they can get goblins or whatever. But like, oh boy, you get me a Leonin slave, right? That's the good shit, right? You get me humans and stuff like that. That's what it comes down to. They're equal opportunities assholes. Yes, absolutely. And I don't know. It's one of those things where I try and think about the different. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me back up. Do you know the city of Ceran? Do you know Eberron?
I'm not super familiar with Eberron though.
God, man, could I feel like I could explain this in just like one image. This is like the whole basis of my whole sort of um kind of thing. Sharn is a city in canyons. It's called the City of Towers or whatever. And it's a vertical city, right? And I remember when I was a kid, I learned about Sharn and I thought it was the coolest shit, because the idea is that there's the lower city, right? There's the depths of the canyons, right? And then there's like the upper city, and then like the top, the canopy of the city or whatever. And it very much got me thinking about like, how can you make cities that are like interesting, that aren't just like I don't know, whatever, Minas
Sure.
Tirith, right? Or something like that. And so Sharn is a really of something that I'm always trying to sort of like emulate. And so the idea of fantasy New Orleans as drow slavers, as the centerpiece of drow slave society. I don't know. It's just been in my brain for a long. It's been in my brain for a long fucking time.
Yeah. No. That. I get it. I understand why it would be. That sounds. It sounds interesting. It sounds very cool and idiosyncratic. And I think you've got enough of that kind of like hook and anchor thing there, right? Like the hook is that they're swamp Cajuns, and the anchor is that they are slavers and otherwise still kind of like horrific evil drow.
Yeah, that's true. Are there things that you think every campaign setting like should have? Like what are some like must-haves in a campaign, do you think?
Um. What do you mean? Like.
I don't know. I'm just
Okay.
interested in
So something. So
wherever you want to take that.
I'm going to pull some of this from something that the Angry GM talks about. Is that non-human races need to have like a very kind of like identifiable different culture, and like 98% of them have to be that, right? Like, because otherwise there's kind of not a point in having them. Otherwise they're just kind of like humans with slightly different stats.
That's a really interesting perspective. Oh my god.
Basically the idea is that like humans are the adaptable ones, and they're the ones that can be like all sorts of different and all sorts of varied. But like 98% of dwarves should be dwarves, right? Like, and most of the time that should be the classic version of it, right? Like if you've got a good compelling alternate version, I think that works too. But like if every dwarf can be just like whoever they like, can just be like as varied as a human, then at some point it's just kind of like, why, right?
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, the original version of this was very much like that, right? Where the whole idea was that, so there's this empire. Empire was first conquered by the Dragonborn, and then it was sort of reformed to be a little bit more egalitarian later. And it looks a little bit like the United States would today, right? In the sense that there are different provinces, and the different provinces of the empire had were very racially coded, right? So there is the Greenreach, it is the Forest, and it is the Elven Province, right? But something I've actually toned that back in the recent iteration of this, partially because I'm trying to get rid of some of this like fantasy racism stuff. I just like don't want to get into.
Sure.
That was sort of the old hook of the campaign was the Empire used to essentially systematically reject all races from outside of the Empire, right? You know, you had humans and elves and dwarves, they're safe, they can be citizens of the Empire, but like everybody else are rejects and they get essentially deported, right? And then the new thing, the hook is that you know, they essentially pass like a piece of legislation passes that basically says, hey, we'll take in refugees, and a huge flood of different races come from all over the continent, right? So you know, you have drow and you have half orcs and you have all these other sorts of kind of like coming into the Empire, and it's about dealing with the friction of sort of that. I got rid of like all that stuff because I
I would
just
say
like
that sounds a little close to home.
yeah. I mean, like, I don't know. There's a lot of stuff that I like. There's a lot of stuff that I've always liked, and there's some of that stuff that still exists, right? For instance,
Sure.
I've always liked the idea of half orc as not. I mean, frankly, I think the origin of a half orc being a human orc pairing, to be a little, I don't know, like
Well,
rapey, I guess.
I would say like so. This is before, you know, the idea. This is the thing the angry GM says that I frankly I don't like a lot. I don't particularly agree with. But it's like, you know, when you had a designated antagonist race, right? Like, you know, if orcs were always evil, right, then that kind of thing made sense as a plot contrivance because like there weren't a lot of happy unions there, right? Like maybe it's a little gross because you're introducing like at least an implicit sexual violence element. But as kind of like, you know, we've moved forward, there is kind of I actually think it's not born out of like, you know, any sort of kind of like push for, you know, DEI or anything. I think just kind of like people think orcs are cool and they want to play as orcs, but also not want to feel like pieces of shit for playing orcs,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, well, so the thing I like about the idea of a half orc is sort of like a I mean, this is something I've featured in our games before, right? You know, Regdar the Red, right? That was in Hell's Rebels, right? Or maybe did I not use this for Hell's Rebels? I have this idea of a character who I use a lot. His name is Regdar the Red. He's sort of a cross between like Martin Luther King and like Genghis Khan, right? He basically thinks that half orcs have been subjugated, and so he rounds up all of the half orcs into a big giant caravan and just moves them around, right? Because and so they just sort of roam around as this horde of whatever 10,000 half orcs. But the idea in my head is always that those are half orcs who are, you know, they come from a long line of essentially half orc, right?
Sure.
It's not that there are new human orc pairings who are creating half orcs that are getting added to the caravan. It is that they are sort of their own race that is sort of pejoratively called half orcs, right? And almost always the idea is that they are essentially in like, you know how like in Sparta in like 300 or whatever, they throw the baby off a cliff because he's like a runt. Like orcs have essentially runts, and they call the runts half orcs, and those are an underclass in orcish society, and they eventually kind of like rebel and leave, and this is sort of what explains that. This is always one of my approaches when it comes to like race stuff, because you know, I don't know, even half elves are actually like this. Half elves are not a human elf pairing. They are essentially they're essentially just elves, but who have a different name because they have like a different society and culture. Like the elves think of themselves as true elves, and they think of them as half elves, and these are people who have essentially taken on a pejorative slur as the name for their species and kind of co-opted it to say, hey, actually no, we're great, we're essentially high elves, this is great.
Okay. And so like I guess your world then doesn't have any sort of like, not that it's like particularly important, but doesn't have any sort of like interbreeding, or if they do, it comes out just as like one.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I sort of think, if I'm being super honest with you, I don't think the science ever makes sense. Maybe it's just because I understand like the nature of a mule or something, but that's more or less exactly what I sort of be like. Yeah, sure, you could have like a pairing, but then you would probably identify with one, you know, kind of like dominant culture in the same sort of ways that like Pathfinder has ancestries or whatever they call them now. it would be something similar. Like, yeah, sure, if you wanted to play like a half elf that is a half human, half elf, um, like you know, human dad, elf mom, you could, but in my head that is not a stable. You are sterile and you cannot reproduce.
Sure.
Is that fucked up? I
I
never
don't
had
know.
to sit down and explain that, to be
No,
honest.
I mean, I am hesitant to like. I don't know. There are some, I think, species that can breed true across species lines. I am not
Mm,
super sure about that. Also, there's kind of like the the broccoli question, right? Like, we call these things different. Like, theoretically, humans, elves, and dwarves could be like broccoli, cauliflower, and kale, which are all the same plant, but with like different genes expressed.
I guess that's true. Yeah.
Um, Buddy, you're messing with my fantasy race breeding king. Yeah, I mean, also, it's magic, right? Like, I don't think too hard about like the the
Yeah,
those
sure.
aspects. Yeah. Uh,
Let's just say that they exist, but people sort of go one way sense. There's
yeah.
a part of me that also wants to protect, like, one of the things that happens when you code fantasy races culturally, right? Which obviously the Angry GM sort of suggests, and I definitely engage, like, when I'm Russian, is that you also are sort of presenting the option of playing like a biracial character, essentially. If you have a dwarf mom and a human dad, right? That it might inform your character in an interesting way. And there's probably a lot of like room space for that. So yeah, the hilarious part is I'm typically pretty anti halvesies. Yeah, you know what? Fair enough. So yeah.
Hold on, I gotta deal with this nonsense. How do I deal with this person? Fan. Sorry. Uh, anyway, let me explain to my LGF that I believe I can get her pregnant if we just try hard enough despite being a cis woman.
you know, Listen.
uh, uh,
Anyway, I'm sorry. We talked about that does that answer your question about like the fantasy race and stuff?
that was my suggestion that
I
like
guess, sure.
yeah that like like that non-human cultures need to be strongly defined and they mostly need to be, which I think it sounds like you're basically following that path, right?
Hmm.
Like, something that's interesting, again, this is like another kind of trope, is that like elves kind of hold the superposition of being like either like wizard scholars or like tree huggers, right? And like, um and
Definitely splitting the difference because half elves are wizard scholars and
right,
half elves are tree huggers.
everybody finds a way to split the difference, right? Like
Yeah.
40k has them as like different civilizations, right? Like, most of the D&D like just kind of like, and some of them are like that way and some of them are like the other way, and like, and I think the more recent editions, both PF2E and 5e, are pretty good about like, just like letting you pick one, whereas like the earlier editions like tried to like take half from both and like, you
Mhm.
figure it out, right? Like,
Yeah, I mean, fourth edition had Eladrin, right? They separated it out into elves and Eladrin. Elves were essentially, tree huggers, and Eladrin were, what we would think of as like high elves, right?
yeah,
Um,
except they were also like extra planar
yeah.
aliens.
Yeah, that's what the other thing is. I really don't like. I really don't like the idea of like extra stuff. Or I guess actually this is interesting. This is something where I think I actually have to retroactively disagree with myself. I used to say that the gods are silent was my preferred sort of like way to do D&D stuff, right? That it was just like, I don't know. I don't even remember how I used to describe it, but then you had this other opposite thing, which was that, like the gods exist because an atheist in one situation is, I'm like butchering the fuck out of this. An atheist is more interesting if gods are real and they
Yeah,
reject them, right? Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. And atheist is interesting because it's a choice to reject. Yeah. The only person who can tell Buddy he's wrong, Buddy.
Yeah, because this came down to whatever the fucking in the Hells Rebels game there was that empire, that atheist empire. I can't remember what they're called, but they just they hate gods.
Yeah, it's one of the. It's like the North African equivalent.
Yeah, I made them Lenin because I like Lenin.
Yeah.
I think Lenin are
Rahadoum, maybe.
Right, yeah, Rahadoum. Yes, absolutely. Right, rhinos is the thing that I really hit on. I actually think that's an idea, is that their mount of choice are rhinoceros, not horses, which is ridiculous. It makes like no sense, but it's so fucking cool, the idea.
Oh, so you can't have a half elf, but you can have rhino cavalry.
But you can have like rhino. Listen, yes, yeah, you know what, Mango? Fucking yeah, okay. Yeah, the Lenin are in this one too. The Lenin actually are interesting. I think part of what I was thinking about is I was thinking about alignment, right? I was like, what are the different alignments of some of the different sort of like other, so you have the empire and then you have like other sort of nations outside the empire, right? So you have kind of chaotic evil, you know, you have confederated goblin tribes, right? Who are just doing goblin, orc, you know, bugbear, all that stuff is just happening. They're just tribes. They're fucking around, right? You know, you kind of have the lawful evil. Drow would be a good example, right? Or even just the neutral evil, like Skaven are probably just neutral evil, right? Maybe they're honestly chaotic evil. But I had this idea for, God, you would love this shit so much. I had this idea for sort of a lawful good evil empire that is sort of it's not Russian because the dwarves are Russian. Okay, so it's not Russian, but it is very oppressively kind of Soviet, which is the idea that the empire is lawful good, okay, and it does in fact believe in the greater good, right? But the greater good is actually dystopian because you have no rights and the empire tells you what to do at all times. And
Sure.
yes, it's doing these things essentially for your benefit. That's good. It is a lawful good empire, but it is also fundamentally wrong. And like most people would think that living in a situation like that, or living in a, I'm sorry, like society like that would be oppressive and terrible.
Yeah. No, I mean, like it's like top-down organization, right? Like maybe FDR-ish, right? Like, which is
Okay,
like.
well, listen, let's not besmirch one of the greatest presidents of all time, Mango. Okay, I'm just kidding.
No, but I do want to like I would say so in the chat. Arahe says lions riding rhinos. Yes, elves and humans voting down. No, you missed an opportunity, Arahe. It should be lions riding rhinos. Yes, elves riding humans. No, right?
God, that's so true. Oh my God, yeah. Jesus. You're so right. You know what? That's actually really funny.
But anyway, to get back to your serious point about the oppressive empire. Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. It's just so like actually it's kind of interesting because it's like, you know, flavors of maybe a little bit of like Chelax, which is like the PF2E kind of like, because PF2 in Chelax is like, you know, pretty definitionally lawful evil, but the way it's kind of played is like the humans aren't necessarily all like the citizenry isn't necessarily all up to date on like exactly what's happening there, right? Like, you know, they don't necessarily understand the extent of what that means, because it you know, it sounds like almost like a lawful neutral society that is like shooting for good, but like maybe missing the mark sometimes, right? Like, because like let's say you grow up in the empire and you decide, you know, how like control this is like you get your job assigned at like, you know, at birth, you get assigned like after not like you get your job assigned, you get to choose.
That's actually sort of an interesting question. So the place is called the Lenin hierarchy, right?
Sure.
And the idea in my head is that everybody has someone sort of above them that they're answering to, and someone they are, you know, they are kind of like ordering, right? Like definitionally. But it's almost sort of like, imagine a world where you could sort of write out, let's say, kind of like greed and like corruption, right? In sort of a Tolkien-esque way, if you could say those are specifically human traits, those are not traits shared by like the elves or for instance, right? What would sort of that society look like? And so the idea is that yes, your whole life is sort of defined by the nature of the hierarchy. you have essentially a master, right? Who is dictating everything about what you're doing and how you're doing it. But this is a person who genuinely does sort of care about you and your well-being. You just have no civil rights. It's actually sort of an interpretation along the idea of, if the lawful chaos access describes freedom versus tyranny, right?
Right.
If we were to use that as a framework and say, okay, you can have a good tyrant, that defines sort of like the
Sure. Sure. And like presumably like 98% of the people are happy with this arrangement, right? Like they enjoy their way of life and they are not. They don't have a problem with it. And like what is it like? It's not quite a benevolent dictator. Like Luce is the benevolent dictator, but the thing about a benevolent dictator is like a benevolent dictator isn't necessarily this rigid of a society, right? Like
yeah. And a benevolent dictator, I think, has overtones of like benevolent has like a connotation, which is not true, right? Like the empire is explicitly telling you what to do kind of at all times, right? But it's also providing for you in ways that other empires wouldn't, right? There is poverty and crime that exists in, I'm sorry, I'm using the term empire in non-specific ways, in the empire that we're talking about with 7 provinces and where all the dragonborn and humans live, right? There is poverty and crime there because this is theoretically, kind of a true neutral society that has a bunch of different
sure.
ways. And it guarantees some of your civil rights, but it doesn't guarantee your right to not die of starvation.
Sure.
Right. It doesn't guarantee your civil right to not get raided by bandits. Right. There are things that account for some of that stuff and that, try and prevent some of that stuff. But like at the end of the day, that level of freedom also means that, there's a certain amount of freedom to starve. Right.
Yeah.
In the Lenin hierarchy, there isn't that freedom. It will take care of your basic needs and probably, kind of like some of your, it's part of it is also like theocratic, right? One of the aspects of this whole thing is that, like there are set sort of like pantheon of gods. All of the gods are worshipped in the empire. Well, kind of sort of. All of the gods are worshipped in the empire, right? But the Lenin only worship one god. They worship the goddess of light, who's also the god of order. And it's sort of like a thing of like, when you have an entire society that is oriented to kind of the extreme, with no counter positions, right? You end up here with sort of like what the Lenin hierarchy is doing. Whereas the humans are also, worshiping the goddess of light, but they worship the goddess of light and the goddess of shadow as a duality. They're sisters, right? In kind of like human interpretation. And so it has this sort of modal kind of, or maybe bifocal would be a better term for it. Kind of like disposition that allows for some amount of dissent, right? Debate among, I don't know, their ideology.
No, that makes sense. And the Land and Empire is just very rigid. Very. I'm curious. What so in this Land and Empire, if let's say you're born, and you just like don't quite mesh with the society, and you try you don't want to do it anymore. What like do they just like execute you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I probably think exile, because like
Okay.
part of my thinking, part of this is that Lenin are a playable race in D5e. Like they have
Sure.
rules for playing Lenin, and Loxodon, who are also represented here. Loxodon being and and I imagine that in like the empire itself, there are probably a certain amount of expats, right? Um, I don't like there are no Skaven. Skaven would be killed on sight, right? Lizardmen would be killed on
Sure.
sight, right? But like, yeah, you could theoretically play a whatever, like a Leonin or a Drow in the Empire, sort of rebelling against the oppressive society from without that you don't want.
Yeah, I mean, theoretically, you could also. I think you could see a version of things where, like, an alien might be like, a they were instructed to go be a mercenary and bring in income and bring it back, to the
Yeah.
city, right? Like, they're mighty warriors. They might as well use that talent, right? Like,
Yeah, I
um,
mean, honestly, there's a part of it that's also built off the Kandari from Dragon Age, who have a very similar sort of that I'm just kind of aping here because I
sure,
kind of like it a lot. But I think Kanari are lame and Lenin are fucking cool. They ride rhinos, okay. But I also needed bad guys for Kovalgrad. It's the important thing. And so the idea of making kind of like lawful good fascists as the Nazis while you are playing kind of lawful evil, sort of Soviet Union. I don't know. The dwarves, like I said, the dwarves are Russian, but they're kind of two Russian in two ways. They're like serfs and boyars, right? Like pre-World War I, super oppressive
Sure.
Russians, and then also there are these big cities. The cities are called furnace cities because all they do is just like crazy amounts of industrial production. Um, those are sort of Soviet cities, or like I don't even know what those are sort of like if you were living in an oppressive brutalist you know Eastern
Honestly,
European
that
bloc in the
sounds like
1950s.
I would say that also sounds like it could be like industrial revolution like England, right? Like
I
like
guess
that.
it is because I think I call them robber barons.
Yeah, yeah.
That the people at the top of these cities are sort of merchant princes who are sort of robber barons, and there's a little bit of stuff. I don't know. It's also whatever, but it is yeah.
Yeah. So and so like I would say like how do these figure into your campaign? And the campaign is like a fight between the dwarven and the Leonin.
Well, so yeah, so Kovalgrad itself is the Leonin. So Kovalgrad is on a river. It's on the and it has three bridges. It's a city with three bridges, and the Leonin basically need to take this city in order to access the bridges to cross the river in like a true, right? There is an Imperial Legion, right? Like the Imperial Legion is the military or whatever, but like there is a unit of like one legion of the Imperial Legion, right? I think I call it a division or something like that. Like one division of the Imperial Legion that sits in Kovalgrad. And they took such heavy casualties defending the east side of the river, which I unironically called the East Bank and the West Bank before all of this Israel Palestine stuff. And I have renamed that part. But like they took such heavy casualties on the east side of the river, and they haven't gotten reinforcements yet that they've just started conscripting refugees from the town. So the idea is that the Legion is going to refugee camps and just conscripting everybody they can find to fight against the Lenin and protect these bridges, and the player characters are conscripted in this way.
Yeah. Okay. That so the backdrop is that the Leonin are in a war against the Empire.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean basically all of the other nations are at constant states of war with the Empire. There really is no trade. Like there's trade between the imperial provinces, but there's really there's no trade with the right? You don't trade with people who are slaving. There's no trade with like the lizardmen. The lizardmen in the south are also lifted straight from Hammer because I like them. But part of the thing I like about the lizardmen is nobody understands them. Nobody can speak the lizardmen language. No one has ever the lizardmen never care about the imperial stuff. They're just doing their shit in the jungle in the south, and it's weird, and nobody gets it, and they just kind of want to be left alone. But they also will sometimes steal imperial citizens and use them as humans in their crazy alien whatever, right? It's like you can't trade with Skaven, right? And so that's one of the I don't know, that's like I guess another kind of like pillar is that basically you're at war with everybody besides the other imperial.
See, this is interesting, because this is the thing I think about sometimes. It's like how much does a setting benefit from like otherwise being relatively at peace, or like the threat is not interfactional, right? It's like maybe something grander, but it's like not like a thing that like you don't have to worry about like kind of like the petty war stuff, right? Like um because like your classic kind of fantasy TTRPG is like you meet in a tavern and like the problem's very local, or maybe it grows in scale, but it's not like an international. It's not like an international threat, or it might be an international threat, but it's not like a an international incident. If it's international, it's only in the sense that it's affecting more than one nation. Um, so it's interesting. Yeah. Go on.
One of the things that I don't want, one of the things that is not written in the setting at the moment is like a true sort of like mobilization or like a state of total war in the Empire. It's more like constant border skirmishes, right? Even though the Empire and the Leonin are at war and they are fighting over Kovalgrad. It's really just the story of like one division that is trying its best to defend Kovalgrad. And maybe it would be worse if Kovalgrad falls and the Leonin bust through and they start taking over huge swaths of dwarven territory, right? But like it's not like it would be it's sort of a good representation of like the 30 Years War, which was, a period of warfare, but that was playing out through small disconnected battles, taking place over a very, very long period of time, versus something like World War II, where like the entire country mobilizes for war, and for 5 years, the whole world is built around is the concept of warfare against other kind of like grand nations, right? Most people in the empire aren't thinking about warfare. They're not dealing with warfare, right? Um, it is just kind of a thing that is kind of chewing away at it's constantly gnawing away at the base, right? You have lizardmen sorting parties journeying north and stealing halfling caravans to get human sacrifices for their crazy arcane shit. You have Skaven who are laying siege to dragonborn cities and taking them one at a time. But that's like a slow war of attrition, right? Where just like, you know, every decade a new volcanic citadel falls and the Skaven, advance 1 inch, right? You have slavers coming from Rao or whatever that are just like going along the coast in half-elven fishing villages, stealing everybody in that village or enslaving everybody in that village to bring back to Thyreth to, be sold, that kind of stuff.
And the kind of like the magic industrial revolution is that a thing that's affected everybody, or is this like a thing centered in the
No.
empire?
Oh, so okay, interestingly, two things. One, mostly no. Um, the power crystals are localized to that desert, right? It's like the halfling desert. The halflings have these caravans. They roam around the desert so that they don't, you can't have a city in the desert because sandstorms would just like wreck you, right?
Sure.
There's one city on the coastline and that's it in the desert. And so that's where the power crystals are. It's like the only source of them, essentially. But the lizardmen absolutely are using what are essentially power crystals, and I'm gonna tease a little bit of lore. There's some secrets to this setting, right? When I envision this setting, there's some stuff that I'm like, this is a secret that I'm gonna probably hold until I ever run a campaign that is about uncovering like this secret. But one of the things that is kind of clear, is that the lizardmen understand arcane magic and have been casting arcane magic and using arcane magic for a long time. And so they have access to sort of this stuff. They just don't use it, right? In the Empire, they want to make, essentially, you would call them like they want to make like tanks and battleships, right?
Sure.
Airships, right? With this stuff. The lizardmen are making weird shit that nobody understands. And then the other thing is that the Skaven steal power crystals and then they warp them with fucked up magic to make warpstone, which is just a core part of Warhammer Fantasy lore that I have to Skaven, and it just happens to dovetail pretty nicely. It also means that like the Skaven sort of hold the southern mountains that border the desert, so there's reason for Skaven to going into the desert and like fucking on some of the mining operations, some of the dune sand, uh, you know, spice crawlers that are sweeping up all of the power crystals. But the Leonin, the Drow, none of these other sort of societies are dealing with Kane stuff in the same way.
Interesting. Okay. Very cool. Ah, yeah. Um,
What do you think about God? What is your position on God? What's your favorite way to do gods in a
gods. Kind of. So gods are real, but not super present, right? Like they grant divine magic, and like maybe like if the story's appropriate, they'll like do a direct contact type thing, but like they're usually distant and like um, but them being real is like means that like you kind of have to, if you're choosing to worship one, it has to be because you agree with their ideals rather than like you know like say the kind of traditional Christian God is like the arbiter of morality. Like if you believe in that, right? Like it's it is good because God says it is good, or because He sees it's good. However you choose to interpret that kind of thing. But you can't really do that in like a you know pantheon type way, right? Like, um, I mean, you could say that these things are good in such that your deity values it. I think just for kind of like epic story, for like traditional fantasy storytelling purposes, it makes sense. It is better for like some gods just to be like evil and like be like, maybe not like, like cacklingly evil all the time, but like, worshippers of Rovagug, which is a Pathfinder 2e god, probably know that they're up to some bad shit, right? Like they're, they're like into destruction, right? Like worshippers of like the devils, right? Like the princes of hell, right? They're making the trade-off. They are doing something that is convenient at the cost of their souls, right? Like,
Right.
I think having like kind of like relatively clear morality like that is good for kind of like making the story work better, right? Like I think there's a place for kind of like a very complex morality. But I think that's just like, I think if you're going to do any sort of like divine magic, you kind of have to have everything be relatively legible at least. Otherwise, you get into like messy situations that I don't think work super well.
That's interesting. That sort of runs alongside some of the things that I think about, but it also runs against it. Like one of the things that I am sort of striving for is you can be a cleric of any god and choose any domain as part of that god, right? So the idea is there's 8 of them. They are diametrically opposed and along sort of like, we would call them like primeval elements, right? Light, shadow, earth, air, fire, water, life, death, right? But that all of those guys have different aspects of themselves. And if you wanted to play, for instance, a I don't know, what would be like a good example of this? Like a healing cleric under the death god. You could. You just have to make a sort of an argument for interpretation of the death god's sort of ethos to make that happen. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
Because one of the things that I like the idea of, Christianity has this where there's one God, there's one Bible, but you have Baptists and Episcopalians and Presbyterians, right? You have Mormons, you have all these different sorts of like offshoot religions that are like built on sort of like one core foundational idea. And so I feel like most D&D gods tend to be based off of the idea of like a pantheon of gods that are set around like the Greek gods or the Norse gods, right?
Yeah.
But in my head, this is more set around the idea of like Christianity or like Sunni Shia Muslim, like denominations, right? Like there are two you could have a temple to Cyrexus, the death god, that worships his aspect as the god of time and his aspect as the god of justice. Do you know what I mean? And those are two different denominations of the same text.
Yeah, I mean, so the thing that rings a little strange to me about that kind of thing, right? Because I also like, I played a character in a game that was kind of like based on like the idea was that he was a fringe interpretation of religion, right? But I like the thing you're talking about with like the different interpretations of Christianity kind of works because the big man is silent, right? Like if you've got like two, let's say, radically different views of this god Cyrexus, right? And those clerics both pray to this god, and they are both granted powers. At some level, they don't really have anything to fight about. It's like, well, obviously, these are both valid, forms of worship of Cyrexus because he's blessing both of them by granting us power.
Okay,
right?
That's interesting. Yeah, I guess I would say you wouldn't be able to. That's really interesting. And that's really fair. I think you wouldn't be able to say, pray to Cyrexus and say, I am a cleric of crime and I want to do crime. Give me spells to do crime, right? He's the god of justice. He doesn't tolerate criminals, right? But if you were to be a cleric of trickery and you were to pray to Cyrexus and you were saying, I am using the weapon of my enemy against them, like an undercover agent or something like that, right? And the idea is that you are going to engage in trickery and deceit in order to bring, whatever,
the greater good or something.
Tricksters, tricksters and deceivers to justice. The Cyrexus would probably. because part of it is interpretational. Like the gods are, the gods are
Sure.
silent, but they do exist. But the way that they communicate is through prophets, right? So gods will periodically kind of anoint mortals on the mortal plane with tremendous power, and these become prophets of a god. So like there's one of the features in the game is I'm sorry, one of the proto campaigns is called the Prophet of Cyrexis. The idea is that there's a little kid in um a human town, and people realize that this child is the new prophet of Cyrexis, and the party has to sort of, in a like Last of Us maybe kind of way, or like a Looper sort of way, like protect this child from all of the forces that are going to try and harness their power for whatever to their own ends, right? Um, and the very first prophets wrote Bibles. So you have like the Bible of Cyrexis or the Book of Cyrexis, right? And there are like different interpretations of what that means, but because it's all filtered through sort of the process of, oh, here's a prophet, and then also they're writing works, and we're interpreting works from thousands of years ago in the modern day. What is, oh well, actually, when Cyrexis has this passage about justice, it allows me the opportunity to whatever, I don't know, do different sorts of things. I kind of want to I feel like I want to leave all of that open. I think that's really interesting, fertile ground.
Sure, and I think there's a way to do that with like a permissive enough God structure, right? It's just like, I don't know, like you describe this as kind of like you describe the different Christian and Muslim denominations. You can't really have internecine conflict, right? Like at least over kind of like over spiritual matters, right? You can't look at a different denomination and say like you are false worshippers of this God because he's granting you both powers, right? Like the God is, and so and that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Like it's just if I wanted to design a thing like a game that played with those kinds of things, I'd need to figure out a way to kind of like make that work, right? Like I mean, the easiest thing I can think of is like,
saying, right? So a conflict between Protestants and Catholics is two people disagreeing over the
proper interpretation of the Bible, right? Like
right.
Like,
but so yeah, the interesting thing is I do, because it is a pantheon, right? And when I'm thinking about conflicts, I'm thinking about intergod, like intergod conflicts, not intra-god conflicts. So like for instance, like the thing about the light god, shadow god, these are both human gods, and they have they have like fundamental like human followers that are opposed to one another, right? But those are sort of two different gods, right? They're two different essentially denominations, like warring against one another. I haven't thought all that much about the idea of like, what does it look like when a group of like two denominations internal to the same god are fighting.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Lou in the chat brings up that you could have like one side of the conflict being deceived or lying. I guess that makes sense, but like I think it's a rough thing to spin, and like maybe that works for like one god, right? Like I think like this is I think one of the fundamental problems with divine magic is that like you kind of implicitly, because like one of the threats is that the god can take it away, right? Like if you don't adhere, you kind of implicitly always have the stamp of approval on your actions if you're being blessed with the power.
Yeah, and that stamp of approval translates in practice to ideology, right?
Yeah.
Like for instance, you could say, if I were to take a cross section of every cleric of a god and map out the different domains, you're actually constructing an ideology. Because if you have a cleric and their ideology and their domains are whatever, war, like war, warder, whatever, like you are crafting an ideology that is conquest and civilization oriented rather than nature. Yeah, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, and I don't. This is not to say that I don't think your idea works. I think it does work in certain circumstances. It's just kind of like you'd say that like the God of Order probably doesn't have that many clerics of trickery, right? There's probably like one or two of them, right? And it's a very specialized kind of thing, right? Like,
yeah, and you would have to frame it in that way, right? In that way of like, I'm using the tools of the thing we oppose in order oppose the thing we oppose. Ideologically, that person is still oriented towards order, right? Or so, for instance, so there's the fire god Zakesh. Part of the fire god's thing is that he's the god of war. He's also the god of like civilization, but he's also the god of like frontiersmanship, right? And so you would have rangers of Zakesh who are learning about animals and trees and all this other sort of shit. But what they are doing is they are sort of opposing they are mastering and harnessing sort of these aren't clerics obviously, but they are mastering and harnessing like the powers of nature in order to civilize wilderness.
In order to subjugate the wilds, yeah.
Yes, exactly, right? And that would have to be the approach. That's based off of a character I played who was exactly that kind of ranger who he was like a woodsman, he was like a like a wilderness guy or whatever, but his whole thing was that he wanted to protect people on the frontier from the dangers of the so yeah.
Now you've given me an interesting thing to think about. It's like if I could design a system that like would allow for divine magic and allow for like internecine conflict in a way that like wouldn't like. I mean, I guess Luke brings up an interesting point, which is like the claim always has to be that like one side is false, and so you actually literally have to make one side false if you're going to make that work, right? Like either deceived or something else.
Yeah, I mean, maybe in a world where the gods are like in my head, even clerics of a god are still receiving like portents and omens from that god, right? They're still receiving whatever dreams or something. They can use because there's like some divine magic that is like divination or whatever, where you can communicate with God. Like you have to have that sort of in order to be able to support, and whatever, in order to be able to support this framework. And you'd have to really figure out how to deal with stuff, especially if things are diametrically opposed. If you have if you have one denomination that believes the exact opposite of another denomination, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that or like the guys just have to like work in like a fundamentally different way than people assume they do, right? Like
yeah, I mean, this is sort of my own thing, which I to my recollection you didn't enjoy, which was the idea that divine magic comes from the raw power of belief and faith, right? Without necessarily being granted specifically, right? But that has this sort of to like carry on tag effect of like, well, what are you saying? Like, I can't play a rogue who's a devout follower of the god of shadows, but like because they're even if they dedicate the entirety of their character to this god or whatever, they don't have access to magic. Cleric, that seems a little.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the like you could do a thing like a priest of Rasmir type thing where like it's actually you're actually learning arcane magic, but you think it's divine magic or something, or like like you could do it in such a way that divine magic is like a form of studied something, and that explains why like your normal devout follower doesn't have access to it, but like
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's interesting because it's funny. I think of divine magic as institutional. I think of divine magic and arcane magic mostly institutional, right? You sit down as a scholar and learn these, like kind of like these magics, these spells, these prayers or whatever. And I think of as kind of martial and primal sort of power sources as being the opposite. It's being sort of intuitive, right? There's another piece that of the idea is that in like the ancient times, most people didn't worship gods, they worshiped sort of a diffuse shamanism, right?
yeah,
But because you can't really teach primal magic to one another, like primal magic is an instinctive thing that you just sort of like have to sort of feel. And this is a time before literacy and writing stuff down. Once a divine god came through and sort of scooped all of the worships out of a shamanistic society out from under itself, right? That's all of a sudden that primal magic kind of died for however many thousands of years until kind of the present day. Because the power of that sort of level of institution is something that drives, drives out this sort of diffuse, abstract, right, strength that comes from nature, essentially.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, I just like it's all interpretation problems, and like the god is trying to tell you the right thing, but like they're just so powerful that actually putting direct knowledge in their brain would literally blow their fucking mind. Yeah, I guess that's probably true, right? Like one of the things that I dislike is I also dislike gods that manifest on the mortal plane, right? Like the idea has to be that if a god wants to influence the mortal plane, they can manifest a prophet, right? They can infuse someone with like their divine power and some level of an extension of their divine will. Same thing with clerics, paladins or sort of whatever else. But they cannot but they themselves cannot cross over, could not have a god that exists on the mortal plane. That feels like an important piece of, I don't know. That's like very true of Forgotten Realms, and I've always hated that, to be honest.
Yeah, I think it can work if it's like very limited and like very short, right? And like there are like rules. It's like I can only like project myself out here for like a day or whatever, right? Because of like the rules that govern. Like I think that's the biggest problem with it, right? Is if you allow them to like be on the plane, you have to have like a reason why they don't do that shit all the time, right? Like like there's a pact that they're all bound to that is like some power greater than them that's like holding them to it.
Yeah, that is one other thing that I have added to this game. There's actually technically 9 gods. This is actually a thing that I'm sort of aping from WoW lore, in a weird way. There's technically 9 gods. There are these 8 gods or whatever, but then there is a 9th god that is understood to exist by implication rather than any explicit confirmation, right? In the same way that you could intuit that a black hole exists by seeing things orbit it without being able to perceive the. This is Chronox, the god of fate, who is, they're so powerful, and they are so powerful, they are above all of the other gods, but they don't empower clerics, they don't empower prophets, they don't empower paladins, right? And if there ever was, like if Chronox ever did like send a prophet, that would be like huge. That would be like a completely different sort of thing. And to be honest with you, like until I play a prophet of Chronox because I'm the specialist boy of all time, honestly, maybe. Because the thing that I like is I like the idea of mysteries like that exist inside of a campaign setting that people can, like figure out, right? Like, what have the lizard been up to? What are they doing? I know the answer to that question, right? But the point is that unless you're doing a campaign that's specifically about going into the jungle to decipher, whatever it is they're sort of planning and how their whole society works, right? They are just weird crocodile people doing freaky shit in their jungle. I understand, right?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes total sense. Yeah. Do you want to talk about anything else in your fun campaign setting?
I don't know. I guess I will ask questions to the chat. If you guys have any questions, I can answer them, but we can otherwise just, we're like 15 minutes over anyway.
Yeah.
The true gods were the friends we made along the way. True. I don't. There is a god, I think, because I tried to assign gods to each domain as like a specific sort of thing, right? So like I think the goddess of wind is like also the goddess of community, right? And I just love the idea of the goddess of friendship. Okay.
Yeah. What do I say? I think that like I think there's also a thing to be said for like leaving large chunks unwritten, right? And just kind of like, yeah, we'll fill things in depending on the way things go, right? Like, this would be neat. Yeah.
Yeah, the funny thing is that we're not actually going to be playing in the Empire because I gave them a million pitches, and the pitch that ended up winning was 7th Expedition. This thing that the fantasy Lewis and Clark that I pitched maybe like 6 years ago, a long time ago. I did a campaign pitch me on the idea of 7th Expedition. But the core conceit of that is that there is a new world that's been discovered, and they're trying to map it out. And the previous 6 expeditions none of them have ever come. And you guys are the 7th. And I have had this idea in the back of my mind for time. But obviously, that doesn't deal with any of this Empire shit. You're across the ocean, right? Like,
How many Doom boats are there going to be?
that's a good question. Yeah, well, because the lore is that, you know, you could never sail here because there's a period of dead wind in the middle of the sea, right? Where if you just tried to sail, you never get past it. But because you have arcane crystals, you can now just make a ship that just goes, right? In the same way that you have like a steamship or something, like coal-powered sort of ship. And so that's exactly what happens. And they eventually, you know, there is a little civilization island off the coast called like White Harbor or something like that, right? You know, which has been sort of like colonized, and there's a little trading port there, but it's sort of the equivalent of like I don't even know what I would call it, right? Like I don't even know like a good historical example of maybe Jamestown, right? But like
Yes.
not even Jamestown, really. Like the Massachusetts, you know, the Massachusetts colonies from the 1600s. It's just sort of the first foothold, and it's a little bit offshore. But you actually have to go onshore in order to whatever, like investigate stuff. And so, you know, they're obviously bringing with them a bunch of whatever politics and everything else, and some of that stuff will matter in White Harbor. But otherwise, Seventh Expedition is all about finding out all the new crazy shit. I'm excited to eat my own boots the first winter. Listen, yeah, it worked for the guys in the Terror. Okay, let me tell you,
Yeah, you gotta find the Northwest
it did not work
Passage.
for them. They all died.
Uh,
I did describe it as the North. Hold on, what did I say? Think the Terror meets Roanoke meets Lewis and Clark meets Hearts of Darkness. Heart of Darkness. That was for all of these. I just sort of outlined a couple of like pop culture things. Like there's the one about going to the Lizardmen. It was think Indiana Jones meets Jurassic Park meets Atlantis: The Lost Empire. Um, but yeah, Seventh Expedition definitely has a lot of boots eating.
delicious boots. Is that where you're going to find the race of sentient pandas?
Oh my god, maybe. I actually know. I actually know how like the you know what people exist on the continent already and what they're like up to. All that stuff already.
Yeah, I'm
I just
sure.
need to. Well, the thing I need to do now is make because the whole purpose of this is making a big giant grid map and letting people just sort of sandbox their way through the map and actually kind of uncover hex by hex each kind of like interlocking, I guess, detail. But that's obviously going to take however much time.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. What else have you been up to this week?
That's a good question. I've been playing Helldivers. That's mostly
Defending
like
democracy.
I've been defending democracy. I've defended democracy so much. We've actually gotten to the point where we are regularly full clearing suicidal level 7 missions.
Nice.
Which feels great. We had this like the thing about it that was really fun is you know, we kind of I don't even know how to describe it. There's a certain level of solo play versus group, right? Where it's like, okay, everybody's going to spread out a little bit as we move towards the next big objective. And like, oh, one person's going to go clear an outpost and pick up the samples. Okay, great. One person's going to go, you know, get this minor point of interest. Okay, great. One person's going to go like solo a bonus objective. That's fine, right? But then like when, you know, we like need to come together or like reinforce one another's position doing. And then also it's like people have different roles in the party, right? So Rachel is almost always off to go find the super sample as like a right? Whereas me and Lou are doing sort of the main mission objectives, and then Mard is outposts. Lou's job is to set down turrets, then kite while everything else kills everything. Yeah, you know, fair enough. I honestly sort of wonder, like, are we going one step higher? I don't even have anything. I have all the stratagems. I bought all the stratagems. I have $50,000, and I don't have anything to spend it on. The only thing that matters in like progression are samples. And honestly, the super samples matter less than the common samples at this point. Like if I were to just go farm like 25 common samples, probably efficient than doing these suicidal missions. But you know, whatever. That's not fun.
Yeah. No, I totally feel that. I have fallen off of the Helldivers a bit. I am very much looking forward. Stop that. Collins is rubbing his face against the green screen. I'm just watching it move behind me. No, you what? No, okay. He does not want to say hi. But Dragon's Dogma comes out on Thursday, technically. I think Wednesday night in the Eastern Time Zone. I'm very much looking forward to that. I picked up some
right before
PAX.
right before PAX, yeah.
Yeah, this is actually why I'm going to PAX on Thursday morning instead of. I mean, there's other reasons too, but if I parked at my girlfriend's place on Wednesday, I would have to move it at 5 in the morning because of street cleaning, and so I'm not doing that. But
Okay, pitch me on Dragon's Dogma. I've been hearing about it, and I guess I understand it to be Capcom Skyrim, right?
imagine Skyrim plus I'll do your pop culture thing. Skyrim plus Monster Hunter plus Devil May Cry is the picture. Like essentially, the thing is that the combat is like actiony, and it's not the most RPG like focused necessarily, but the combat's really cool and engaging and active, and that's the thing that I'm looking forward to. Also, there's some like cool ideas, right? Like one of the advanced classes is the Arcane Trickster, and you can like make like smoke dummies that like your enemies will attack, and like you can put like a smoke clone of yourself on a smoke platform, and then an enemy will try and go attack it and like fall off a cliff because like they literally Wile E. Coyote themselves off the cliff, which is
wow.
But that's and that's one class. There's like the Mystic Spear Hand is kind of like a Jedi almost. It's got like like telekinesis and like like Force E looking stuff and like a dual-handed sword. And you can switch between these classes as yourself. It's all single player. You get a pawn, which is an AI companion, and then you can hire other pawns, which are made like the pawns you hire are other people's pawns that they have put up to like go to go help other people. If you don't have an internet connection, you get stock ones, but and then what was the other thing? Oh, it's also supposed to be like insanely kind of like unforgiving, but in like a fun way. Like like you will miss things because you will, right? Like it's one of those things where it's like it is nearly impossible to like hit every corner. And like if one of the examples they gave is like if an NPC dies, they'll go to the morgue, and then eventually, and like you can revive them with like the resurrection item if you go there, but eventually they'll be buried, and once they're buried, they're gone forever, right? So it looks neat. The first game I what's the word I dabbled in, essentially it got to a point where it's what's it it's like it, or rather it's it was a very rough game, widely, acknowledged that it needed a bit more time to polish it. Essentially, this game, Dragon's Dogma 2, is like the first game, a lot of ways, the first game again, but with the time it needed to like fully bake. And so, I've seen a lot of excitement for it. Interestingly, they're like, so part of the thing they're doing for promotion is like pawns, sponsored by, sponsored by famous Twitch streamers or whatever, right? And so one of the guys that I follow, Willie Versus, is doing it. It's also got like Asmongold to Sphere Hunter, which is like opposite ends of the spectrum, right? Like Asmongold as like the shithead, and Sphere Hunter's like a like a trans creator that's like very much kind of like an opposite corner. So we'll see how it goes. Yeah. And then I've been playing a bunch of Street Fighter. I dropped rank because last Friday, I want to say, I just I started playing and I like went on full tilt and I didn't let myself stop it, and things went poorly for me. But
I'm sorry to hear that, buddy.
Yeah, I didn't drop a full categorization. I just dropped from like plat 4 to plat 3. Yeah. But the grinding all day. I'm always on the grind to get my ranks. What else? Like I was telling you before we got on the cast, I'm putting together some Magic decks for PAX. I'm playing in my works Markov Manor Sealed League. I have lost a bunch, but I forget the name of the card, but I got this very nice card that I built my deck around. It's 1 green, 1 white, and then 1 green or white. It's a 4/4, and it's got 3 activated abilities. 1 green, one any is grant teach creature death touch, one white grant creature vigilance, one white, two colorless grant creature double strike. And it's just like such a good card. It's such a good card that it immediately gets targeted by removal as soon as it comes out in the field. But
Sure, yeah. I mean,
yeah.
that wins it in combat as long as you have unlimited mana for it, right?
Yeah, yeah. It is a very powerful bomb, right? Like even just like this, 4/4 for 3 is just like pretty great.
Yeah, a 4/4 for 3 that can give itself double strike
Yeah,
and vigilance is actually kind of insane. Like double strike, vigilance, and like, man, just like walking into any fight with 5 mana open that you could like give it all 3 if you wanted is like, that is pretty brutal.
yeah,
What an interestingly designed card. Because normally I think of those effects as being very inefficient and bad, right? You don't want to be spending your mana on temporary combat modifiers, right? But it just happens to be such a good collection of combat modifiers, I guess.
yeah. And
Yeah.
it's also for a sealed game where like basically you have the opportunity to like swing on face a bunch of times, and you want to use that when you can because otherwise you're not going to have stuff to do, right? Like,
Yeah. I guess the sealed league is obviously very different than something else.
yeah, like in a constructed format. Yeah.
Who is like managing this thing at your work? Like organizing it, I guess.
One of my coworkers, he organizes them every expansion. Basically sends out an email. The whole office, anybody in the office who's interested, like gives them $20. He gives them 6 packs, I think. And then we play against each other round robin style.
Yeah. So the thing I've always wanted to do is sort of a commander. I've heard about these. I've always wanted to do it, which is that you designate a set of commander decks, right? Like a set of the commander decks that comes out. People get whatever deck they want, right? And then every expansion you can buy a certain number of packs, like 3 packs or something, and you can only add the things from those packs to your commander, right? And so it has this sort of like effect of keeping just kind of keeping a ceiling on sort of like power level and stuff. But you could also do like really interesting things. Imagine if it goes 2 years, right? That's 10 expansions because Magic is fucking insane,
Yeah.
right? That's 10 expansions, 30 packs. You could almost rewrite your entire commander deck, right? If you wanted to
Get lucky with colors.
Yeah. That's the other thing is that you would also have to like make sure you're sort of colors best. I feel like the best way to do this is I would say like I don't know. I don't know what I would say, or I don't know how I would approach that, but
I saw in packs there's like a commander draft. I don't know how. Like I think there's like specific commander draft boosters, but that seems like an interesting thing to do. I don't know like how it works. Like I guess they have to like guarantee you a legendary creature at some point, but
yeah. I mean, do you know about cubes? Have you ever done a cube draft?
Yeah, but a cube is like assembled, right? Like it's
I suppose that's true.
Right.
I mean, there was a commander set that was built to be drafted.
Yeah, I think it's Baldur's Gate
Legends or something, or was it Baldur's Gate? Oh wow!
Well, so the one at PAX is a Baldur's Gate commander.
Oh okay.
Commander draft.
Yeah, I do know that there is a commander set that is built to be. That was like one of the selling points of it, but I never actually participated in the drafts because one of the things is that the boosters had more. I'm pretty sure the boosters were 20 cards each, and boosters were 20 cards each or something, and you did 6 of them or something, like 6 rounds of drafts. It was 30 cards. You did 4 rounds. Sure. It was like some weird number of rounds. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd be interested in trying some sort of sealed format for Commander just to see what it was like.
I love like fucked up Magic form. Like Star is obviously. I always pitch that we play Star because I think it's a great format for player game.
Yeah, I mean, if this forgetful fish deck comes in, I'll make sure to play a game with you at some point.
Yeah, for real. I haven't looked. You sent it to me, and then I never actually looked up like rules for it. But
it plays by standard Magic rules, but it's like the forgetful fish is the Dan, and the Dan's a 4/1 creature that if you ever stop controlling an island, you have to sacrifice it. And so there's like a lot of kind of like turn all lands into mountains types effects, right? Like dumb stuff like that, and like counter spells, and like it's a shared graveyard and a shared deck. So like you putting things back on top of the deck to like force your opponent to draw like a thing that isn't very useful to them, that kind of thing.
Interesting.
Yeah, it used to, like I think I mentioned this last time. It used to be a super cheap deck because no one wanted any of those fucking cards, and now it's a popular format. So the deck's like $250. I bought a proxy off of Etsy for like $43, but like, you know, and like I looked into it myself, and that like I think essentially someone did a group buy on like one of these custom MTG card sites, and like put out like, you know, tried to do a group buy for it, but like, you know, there's just like things you can get a better rate on the cards, but just like at the size, the deck's 80 cards, so like it's like $80 for the deck, right? So
Can't attack unless defending player controls an island. When you control no islands, place Dan. Okay, interesting.
yeah.
Interesting. Okay, well, you know,
Yeah.
fuck yeah, I guess. Yeah, I don't know. Honestly haven't been doing anything all that much. I've been playing some Ever After Falls, right? One of our sort of internal games. I keep making eyes at Hearts of Iron. I am so intimidated by Hearts of Iron. I don't know that I've ever been intimidated by a game to the extent that I've been intimidated by Hearts of Iron. And I know I would have fun if I just sat down and played. And I played a game as Italy to like remake the Roman Empire or whatever, you know, do this alternate history bullshit that like the game is kind of like known for. But for some reason, I'm just so spooked by like the level of mastery that I just keep watching YouTube videos about it and never actually playing Hearts of Iron.
Hey, you know, whatever makes you happy, man.
They added a subscription service to get all of the DLC. See that I don't want to like buy into the subscription service because I feel like I would need all the DLC. Fun.
Well, I mean, if you wanted to just try it, like buying a 1 month subscription seems like a better way to do it than like, you know, buying all of it forever.
That's probably true, right? Like $8 to just like get 1 month of, you know, what fun.
Yeah. Play it till it's out of your system, then drop off.
Yeah.
Well, do you have anything else you want to talk about?
No, I am good.
All right. Well, we'll wrap it up then. If you like to email us about anything we talk about on the show, you can email us at derpsgames@gmail.com or podcast@derpsgames.com. You'll follow us at twitch.tv/derpsgames or youtube.com/derpsgames. All the links are down in the description. Rate, review us wherever you find podcasts. That's everything I have. Buddy, do you have anything else you're looking to promote?
I do have one thing I'm looking to promote. We talked about it a little bit. I'm going to be at PAX East this year. We're doing PAX East. We're showing off a bunch of cool games. Okay, we're bringing games to PAX East, and that's it. That's the story. Okay.
Yeah, if you're going to be at the PAX East booth, visit the Akapara booth or PAX
yeah,
East.
15091 is the booth. That's it.
I will be there as well, not at the booth necessarily. Although there's a decent chance you'll see me there because if it's anything like last year, every time I walk past the booth, I'll like go and like give Betty a high five or something.
True.
But if you,
I don't know if we're central. We were really central last year. I don't know if we're
yeah,
gonna be at central, but who knows? We'll see.
yeah. All right. Well, with that, I'm going to say until next time, dear listeners.
Until next time, loyal.